Parents of TikTok, what is the creepiest thing your kid has ever said to you?
Okay, I got one for you. So, my son, who is 6 now, he was about 3 at the time. I wake up out of a dead sleep at like 3 a.m. to him standing next to me in front of my bed and just staring at me. I wake up and I was like, "What are you doing? What do you want, baby?" And he just blankly stared at me. And the words that came out of his mouth terrified me. He looks at me dead in the eye with this zoned off look in his face and says, "You look different with a head." I mean, for real? Terrified me.
So Jasmine goes away to overnight camp, and her mother and I decided to go into her room, deep clean, and defunk this bedroom. When she got home from camp, she was pleasantly surprised. And she starts looking around at things, and she starts rooting around her closet, and I said, "No need, sweetheart. We got rid of all the dead bodies." And with this Kubrick psycho stare, she looks at me and says, "You found them?" And I was laughing, but I look back at her, and she's staying in character, and for a second,
Okay, so I'm not a parent, obviously, but I wanted to share the story that happened to my brother. So when he was about 3 or 4, he came to my mom's room with me and my sister, and he was like, "Mom, there's a man in my room covered in tape, and he needs help because he's cold." I was like, okay, so we went to go check. Obviously, there was no man, but his room was cold, so we just put a heater in it, left it be. We went to sleep the next night, and, we woke up in the morning. I heard him sleep talking. I just brushed it out because he usually does that. But then in the morning, he came into my room. He was like, "Tatum," he came back again. And he looked like a giant toy. So he looked like a big toy. I was like, okay. And he's like, there was still tape on him, but he said he needed help and he was cold. And he said he didn't know what to do. So my brother didn't know what to do. So the big toy jumped out the window, cracked it, and it got hit by a car. And then we went to go check in his room, and his window was cracked.
So last summer when I was pregnant with my last son, my middle child was he was fitting to turn 3, and he came up to me with a pair of scissors and told me that he was going to cut my baby out of me and that I was going to bleed a lot. Like, where do they get this shit from? Needless to say, he did not cut the baby out of me. I took the scissors from him, and now they're best friends, as far as I know.
My oldest child wakes me up in the middle of the night and tells me about this horrifying dream that she just had, where a massive demon is straddling her and has these 2 fingers that are 9 inches long, and they are on fire, and he is trying to, how she described it, claw the life out of her. And she was able to escape her bed and wake up and come tell us. Well, later that day, my second oldest comes and tells me he had the same frickin' dream. So I'm going through their room, praying over their space and praying over their bed, and both of their pillows have massive, seared, singed claw marks through them. Literally parallel. Both of their pillows. When I tell you, I about burnt my house down.
So I went to pick up my 10-year-old son after work from my grandmother's house, and he was being weird. So I said, "What's wrong?" And he was like, "Don't worry, I didn't kill her."
I have a couple of these, and they all involve my oldest daughter. First one was when she was about 2 years old. She went up to my husband and immediately said, "Dad, day by day, week by week, month by month." Might not seem a little bit creepy to you, but before me and my husband even got married, his grandmother passed away from dementia, and that is exactly what she would tell my husband every time that they saw each other. The next time that she creeped us out is whenever she was rocking back and forth in her room going, My grandmother passed away when I was 2 years old from ovarian cancer, and at that point, whenever I was 2, it went to her brain, and that is how she would soothe me, is by rocking back and forth going, The next time she was about 4, my youngest daughter was 2, and she told me, "Mom, did you know I have a brother?" And I said, "No, you only have a sister, baby." She was like, "No, I have a brother in the sky." I had a miscarriage when I was 18 years old. She didn't even know that I was pregnant before her. Last time she creeped us out, she had a dream about a man who lived in the sky with glowing eyes and that she saw her sister in the future.
This one would not be my kid. This would be some random child in, it was a Sears, some sort of department store. Anyway, we'll just say Sears for the sake of the story. Anyway, so this little girl runs up to me and gives me a great big hug. And she says, "Daddy, I missed you." And there's a mom and a dad. And they're both looking at me and looking at each other, looking at the kid. And the mom says, "Honey, that's your daddy." She says, "No, he was my daddy before. In my last life, before you were my mommy, he was my daddy." And he says, then I'm like, the fuck? And she goes, "Okay, Daddy, I gotta go now. I love you, bye." And I'm like, bye, kid. That memory still bothers me.
Parents of TikTok, what is the creepiest thing your kid has ever said to you? So this morning, I take my 4-year-old to the doctor. He had an ear infection a couple of weeks ago. We went in for a follow-up. Everything's okay. As we are leaving, we pass a couple of wheelchairs in the lobby. And my 4-year-old looks at them and says, "I've never used a wheelchair." And I say, "Well, your legs work just fine. You don't need a wheelchair." And my 4-year-old says, in his perfectly innocent 4-year-old voice, "After our car accident, I'll need a wheelchair."
So the other day, my 4-year-old is jumping up and down all around the house. I finally asked her to stop, and she's like, "Why am I going to bother the people that live underneath us?" And I'm like, no, nobody lives underneath us. And she was like, "Yeah, they do." And I'm like, okay, so up until this last year, we've lived in an apartment. So I'm like, okay, maybe she thinks people live underneath us. So I explained to her that in a house, it's just dirt underneath, there's nobody under there. She was like, "No, I know there's people under there." And I'm like, okay, play along. I was like, "How do you know people are under us?" And she was like, "Because I know they're there." And I was like, "Well, why would they want to live in the dirt? Because there's no house down there." And she was like, "Well, they can't leave because our house is protecting them." And I'm like, "What do you mean our house is protecting them?" And she was like, "I don't know, they just can't go. They said that our house protects them. They're safe down there. They're okay." Okay.
So when I would explain to my son where babies came from, we would say, "You came out of mommy's tummy." Well, all of a sudden he started saying, "Well, I was in the army, and then I came out of mommy's tummy." And I'd ask him, what do you mean? He said, "I was in the army." He said, "I was in the army like you were in the army. But I was in the army, and then I came out of mommy's tummy, and I became your son."
Y'all ready for this? Now, I've told y'all I have 2 sisters. I'm the oldest. There are 3 of us, and we're all girls. Now, what I never told y'all was that my father was married before he married my mother, and he had a daughter with that woman, but that baby died. Mind you, I'm the oldest of my dad and my mother's kids. My father had no previous children before that daughter who died. And according to my dad, she died while she was being born. Now, I got older. I think I wasn't even 10 years old. And my dad was telling me about this story. He was telling me how, he had another little girl before me, but she died. And he said, had she not died, he probably would have stayed with that mother and would have had a family with her. I looked at my father and told him, "Yeah, I know. That's why I left. I didn't want her to be my mom."
So when my son was like 3, he's like almost 6 now, he used to go play in our backyard by himself a lot of the time. And he would be like digging or whatever, and I'd go out to check on him, and I'd be like, "Hey, what are you doing?" He would tell me he's playing with our neighbors who don't have eyes. And he would say that all the time. He would always talk about, like, every time he'd be playing by himself, he'd say he's playing with our neighbors who don't have eyes. And I asked him, like, what happened to the eyes? And he would just say, "I don't know, they just don't have eyes." He also used to talk about how terrified he was of his bedroom because someone would watch him at night through the window. And he said they used to crawl in through the window and eat his goldfish at night. Needless to say, we got security cameras outside to make sure there was no one watching him, and we never saw anyone watching him. But I don't know, it was pretty creepy.
Okay, so maybe not the creepiest thing that she's ever said to me, but definitely gave me goosebumps. Last year I was watching TV with my then 4 or 5-year-old, and the Northern Lights came on. She's like, "Oh, I've been there." I'm like, "No, I don't think you have, baby." She's like, "Oh yeah, I was there with Papa." "Papa who?" And she goes, oh, Papa Laird. He's really nice. Now, the thing is, we don't know anyone by that name except for my grandfather, who was named Laird, and died when my mother was 14. I have never met this man. We don't talk about him. So, yeah.
I don't have no kids, but I've heard some creepy ass stories that have been stitched to this video, and I'm telling you now, if my kid ever says something like that, they express shipping going right back up the coochie, I swear.
So about a month or so ago, me and my 2 kids were going to visit my dad. And every time I go to visit my dad, I always play my mom's 80s playlist. My mom passed away in March a few months ago, so I always like to listen to 80s music. It just reminds me of her. So I'm sitting there jamming out to the song, and I had my elbow resting, and I was doing like this little hand dance thing, and I just automatically remembered like when I was younger watching my mom do that to the same song growing up. And it just like brought tears to my eyes because I just remembered it so vividly. But I was wearing sunglasses and I had the music turned up, so I was crying like silently because I don't want my kids to hear me crying. And then I hear my daughter, "Hey mom," and I was like, "Oh, what is it, baby?" Trying to cover my crying. And she said, "Sugar," which is what she calls my mom, "she's sitting right next to you." What? It was just crazy because she had no idea what I was thinking or anything. Creepy but sweet.
It's not creepy, it's actually a little bit amazing, but I'm going to have to give a little bit of backstory so it makes sense. So 2 weeks after I gave birth to my son, my mom was diagnosed with stage 3 metastatic breast cancer. My mom was absolutely in love with my son. She absolutely adored him, and the name that she picked out for my son to call her was Gamma, Gamma. It was kind of like a joke, kind of like gamma ray radiation, like a pun off of the treatment that she was going through. My mom ended up losing her battle before my son learned to talk, so he never learned to say her name. One weekend when I was out of town with my friends very recently, my son is almost 3, around 2 p.m. I had a mental breakdown. I was just missing my mom so much. When I got home later that day, my son had been napping around 2 p.m. and he informed me that Gamma came to see him while he was napping. So my son was too young to remember my mom. He had absolutely no way of knowing that that was the name that she picked out.
So when my daughter was 4, we were walking out to the car real quick to grab something before church started, and she looks up at me with the big blue eyes and she says, "Mommy, will you celebrate my birthday when I'm in heaven?" Yeah, that about does it.